Today is the 26th of April, 2005, and I am Jessica Clark, the Teresa Mack German to Russia History Fellow and the Project Coordinator for the Germans to Russia Oral History Project. It is a pleasure to visit with Reverend Hartmann in Fargo, North Dakota. Okay, we'll start with some introductory questions.
Okay.
For the record, why don't you state your full name, date and location of birth?
My name is Marvin Hartmann, and I was born in Douglas County, South Dakota, on February 19th, 1932.
Did you grow up there? Did you live there your entire life?
Well, until about I was born in 1932 and went off to college in 1950. So essentially, I've not been back there as a resident, since 1950.
Okay. Let's see. Did your parents and or relatives tell you any stories about your birth?
Actually, my parents were a little bit modest about those kinds of things, but I do know that Dr. Bollinger from Parkston came out and delivered me in the home. I guess my mother gave birth to me in the home, and I might also add that I had a grandmother who was a midwife, and my mother's mother, and apparently she was there then to help take care of me, but my understanding was that Dr. Bollinger came out, and incidentally, he was also my doctor then later on. Took my tonsils out when I was in high school.
That's experience.
Yeah, same doctor.
Okay. What is your earliest recollection or memory?
Oh, good heavens! I tried to think about this last evening, and what I actually remember was that my mother had surgery in Mitchell, South Dakota, I think it was in 1935. That would have made me about 3 years old, and I know these stories were circulated at the time, that when I was more aware of what was going on. But I think I do remember that the day she was brought home from the hospital, my dad helped her into the house, and she had a kind of a maroon kimono on. And I remember that. And the other thing I remember about it is that my brother and I, now remember I was about 3 years old, my brother and I were out on the yard. We lived with my grandmother. And my dad then went to look for my brother and myself, and we were on top of a chicken coop. My brother was 1.5 years older than I was, so we were under 5. I was 3 and he was about 4.5 years old. So we'd crawled on top of this chicken coop, and I do remember a bit of a scolding about that. Another thing I remember at that age was my mother helped at a place where I think it was her niece gave birth to a baby, and we went over there, and I remember seeing this mother who had just given birth in her home, and I know the person that was born was 3 years younger than I was, so I was 3 years old at the time. And there was one other incident that I remember when I was 3, and that was my dad was I guess you could call him sort of a technician on a telephone line. That is to say, he farmed, but we were on a party line, and we were 10 miles from Delmont, which was our kind of my hometown. And he'd have to drive along in the car with a fishing pole and untangle the telephone lines after a windstorm because they were short out and you couldn't hear on the phone. There'd be static. And so we would drive between my home and Delmont. And I know for a fact that in this one farmstead we drove in, and the lady in the house said, "Well, how old is Marvin now?" And he said, "He's 3 years old." And this lady was amazed, the time had gone so fast. She wasn't aware of this. But these are kind of 3 events that occurred when I was a little kid that I remember without having been told, what happened in those years.
That's a pretty young age to have memories, too.
Well, I don't know if it is or not, but I clearly remember the events and the car we drove in and all that.
What was it like growing up on the prairie?
Well, I guess at that time I thought it was pretty neat because I didn't know anything else. And open country, and we have pictures from that period that amaze me for the simple reason that it was so bare. In my high school years, we had planted trees and the farmstead was covered, with trees and things. But in the early years, in the 30s, even as a child, I remember the whistling wind and the dirt blowing and all of that. And it was, in some sense, it was kind of melancholy and miserable. But on the other hand, what did I know? I mean, this was my family and this is where we lived, and you make do, and we enjoyed it. I mean, I enjoyed it very much. But it was kind of bleak, and the roads weren't good, and but of course I didn't concern myself with those hardships.
What did you find especially beautiful about the plains?
Oh, good heavens. I would say the smell of earth turned. That's fantastic. Mown alfalfa fields, lilac blossoms in the spring. They're just, beautiful, and all different things. We could hear our neighbors lived about a quarter of a mile away, and we sometimes in the evening, when things quieted down, we could hear them talking on their yard, and little things like that. I suppose they didn't create too much of an impression on other people, but these are the things that I remember. But the bad part of it was the dirt in the 30s. I remember our home was always full of grit, and we would have dust storms. I remember about 1938, I was maybe 6 years old, something like that. We would walk to the neighbors, and when we got there, around your eyes and lips, you'd have this caked mud from just breathing the dirt blowing. It was bad, and really not very comfortable. But again, everybody else managed, and so we did too.
Could you describe the winter months in your childhood? What was winter like?
Well, my school years, I remember on rare occasions being taken to school, but I do remember, in fact, I looked at some albums last night, incredible amount of snow. Our yard sometimes had 6 feet of snow blown in, with heavy winds, and hard as a rock, you could drive over it. And going to school, I had to walk a mile to the west, which was always facing a 3/4 northwest wind. And I know one time I balked. I got out to the mailbox, and I came back, and I said, I can't do it. And Dad had to go out and thaw out the carburetor on the car and get the thing started. It took me to school, but that didn't happen very often. A mile, just a mile. But it was west of us, and it always meant in the morning facing a northwest wind in the winter. And that part of it was kind of rough. But as kids, I mean, we tunneled through the drifts and at home. In fact, I remember one time the drift between our cattle shed or the horse barn and the house. I suppose it was maybe 125 feet in between, 150 feet. There was an 8-foot snowbank there, and again, as I said, hard as a rock, and my brother worked a couple days tunneling through toward the barn. I mean, it was more fun than anything. But they were pretty bad. 1940 was particularly bad. I have a picture where the Army came out of Omaha. There was a guard unit in Omaha that had caterpillars with bulldozer blades on the front, and they actually came into Douglas County and bulldozed to the haystacks so that farmers could get hay from the hay fields to the cattle. And the snow was so high on our yard that they had to come in and do what I call a kind of a sequential snow movement, where they push and back off and push and back off just to make it possible to get around in the yard. I mean, but in the later 40s, I don't recall that it was that bad in the later 40s. Things, I think, after the war started temperatures changed and a different climate changed. But my early years, we'd sleep upstairs where it was awfully cold, and sometimes would tear downstairs to get dressed, and because the stove in the kitchen would be going by then. So, and of course, as kids, we had chores. We'd have to help milk and clean barns and the whole bit, you know, to be able to function.
What were the summer months like?
Well, it depends on what particular age group or age you're thinking of here. But in the 30s, when I was a little child, like I said, there was a lot of wind, and it was always dry. And I mentioned earlier this howling. This is the thing that kind of haunts me to this day, because homes weren't sealed like they are now, and there was always a wind, and there was always this dirt, and my mother would fight it tooth and nail, sometimes taking, in a particular bad dust storm, would take towels and make them wet, and since they were double hung windows, you'd jam them down and then put towels on top so the wind wouldn't blow in and blow the dirt in. And she was a very fastidious person, and she hated to have the house dirty or the floors gritty, but this was just a constant battle. But then later on in the 40s, it was, we started working early. I mean, even in the late 30s as a little kid, I remember dragging 5-gallon buckets of chicken feed around to the chickens and cleaning chicken barns. One story, I think it probably came out of I'm guessing perhaps late 30s or early 40s, but in the summers, and it's kind of gross, but I have to tell you about it. Chicken coops, we would clean the chicken coops then thoroughly during the summer. There were roosts and there were pits for droppings underneath. We'd clean them out. And the interesting thing about it was that chickens would have lice, and they would crawl onto the roosts, and then you'd lift the roost to clean underneath and take a spade and hit them, and the lice would fall out into your hair and neck. And then usually this was done in late June or July, maybe August, maybe July when it was hot. So you'd be sweaty, you'd have the lice, and then the dust from the chicken manure, which caused my brother, who was a little more disgusted with it than I ever was, said, if I ever farm, I'm never going to raise chicken. Well, guess, when he went to farming, he raised chickens. But anyway, those were some pretty miserable years. But I don't know. In summers, it was always work, baling hay and straw. And we worked together with our neighbors. And in the early years, before my dad had a combine in 1950, we would go in threshing crews from one farm to another. And I only had one brother. I didn't have any sisters, so it meant I had to go home. We'd be farming, we'd be threshing 2-3 miles from home, and I would go home. Then I rode a pony and did the chores in the evening with my mother and my brother, and Dad were with this crew. But what was kind of nice about that was that the work was very intense when they were doing it on our farm, because the neighbors, there'd be 4 or 5 neighbors would get together and they'd run this threshing rig. And when it was on your farm, you had to do double time because there was grain hauling and food and the whole bit. But my mother used to say when it was over, then she could relax because she had nothing more to do. The crews were on other farms, so that was kind of neat. But anyway, I did the normal things that kids did in those days. We milked a lot of cows and did a lot of chicken chores and farming and shocking grain, and harvest time was always kind of head over heels, and everybody worried about weather, terrific heat to too much moisture, too much rain in the fall, and all those problems. But as I said several times now already, I really didn't have to deal with the economic aspect of it because I was happy. I was working, having fun, and friends and the whole bit. But my dad and mother worried more about the finances than I ever did at that point. And childhood bliss, that's right. Until I went to college and some of the costs started to build up.
Real life set in?
Real life, yeah, exactly.
What was your favorite season and why?
Oh, good heavens, I suppose spring. Usually after long winters, things got kind of dull, and it was nice, and it was always kind of nice to me to get out. I'm thinking probably late 30s, early 40s, even late 40s, when I started high school in 46. In the spring of the year, it was always kind of nice to get outside early in the morning and hear. We lived in sort of a township that was it was called Valley Township, but it was kind of a depression. The whole county was, township was kind of in a depression, and we could hear so well in the summer mornings. You could hear farmers, a mile and a half over here with a tractor and over here, and it was kind of beautiful. And of course, once the grain started to come up and all of that, it kind of represented new life and everything that you and I would associate with the spring and so on. So I guess that was my favorite. One of the reasons also is that in the later, being on the farm and in the fields later on in the summer, usually what I call the burr crop, the sand burrs and cockle burrs would be around, and in the corn stalks in the fall it was pretty miserable because I was somewhat allergic to for example, if a sandburr would stick in your socks or something, and the irritation from that, and I had hay fever, and so that made life more miserable, late summer, early fall. But other than that, you just put up with it. What spring I think was my favorite, early summer.
Did you ever go hunting?
Well, my dad didn't do. He had a shotgun, but we never really did a lot of hunting. Pheasants, yes. I remember we had hired men in the late 30s and early 40s, and they would occasionally go out hunting with my dad. What was the most fun actually was hunting jackrabbits with my brother at night in the car. It was illegal, but we did it anyway. It was a lot of fun. You'd ride, one guy would drive and the other guy would ride shotgun, and on moonlit nights you could see these clumps in the stubble fields in the fall. You'd see it looked like rocks out in the field, but we knew they were rabbits, and they were there by the hundreds of them. And of course that's why nobody really paid any attention to the law. You swing the car off to the right and blast away and throw the rabbit in the trunk and go on. And
So did you eat them?
oh no. Actually, after World War II, there was a guy that started a mink farm close to Armour, South Dakota. And as I recall, we sold some there, but it was not uncommon in the dead of winter to shoot a couple dozen rabbits, and then we just nailed them to the north wall of a garage, so the sun wouldn't hit them, and keep them there for a while. And they actually fur farms bought them for feed for their mink, but also I have an idea they were skinned, and some of the clothing, collars and things were made out of the rabbit hide. But so far as hunting ducks and geese, I've got to say I didn't really do that. I don't know why. I guess I never was really that interested in it, but we did shoot a few rabbits. Also, one other thing you probably aren't aware of this, but sometimes there'll be 20, 25 guys, and they'd surround a whole section, drop off 6 or 8 along one leg, on one side, and then 6 or 8 or 10 guys on the other mile, and so all the way around, and then we would converge in the middle of the section. In fact, later on from 1958 to 1962, I was a pastor in Hecla, South Dakota, and we had so many guys hunting rabbits, we surrounded 4 sections at one time and drove them to the middle. And you can't imagine how many jackrabbits were in there, and fox and all of that. And once the group got within 4 square blocks in the middle of this, you'd have to be careful where you shoot, because you could shoot across and hit somebody else. So what we did then, we simply made an opening and let them run through, away from the circle, and then shoot them out there. But it sounds cruel, but really there was such an infestation that it was actually detrimental to crops and especially fox. They'd kill all the pheasants, eat the eggs and so on. So it was never considered immoral, to go out and shoot all those rabbits, because they were in abundance. But that's about the extent of the hunting I did. I didn't get a shotgun until I was as a pastor. I mean, we always had one at home, but it belonged to my dad. But anyway, he bought me one. Took a 3-inch shell. You could knock a goose down from about 300 feet, I think.
Oh my.
Of course, you could feel it on your shoulder after that,
Yeah.
too. It was a small cannon.
Leave a nice big bruise there, too.
Yeah. Oh my.
You mentioned your grandmother. Did she live with you, or was she just there at your farm?
The home we lived in actually early on belonged to my grandmother on my dad's side, my dad's mother. And from 1929, when my parents, or 28, when my parents were married, until 1935, an unmarried sister of my dad lived with her mother in an apartment in the house that we occupied. It was her house, but we were on, my mother and dad and my brother were on one side, plus the upstairs, and then my grandmother, my dad's mother, and her youngest daughter were on the other side. But then her youngest daughter got married in 1935. Well, that's another thing I remember, that wedding, and that was in 1935, so that's another 3-year-old deal. But anyway, I had another grandmother and grandfather that lived about 1.5 miles from where we lived, and my mother was over there a lot because she was the youngest of the family and married, I think, when she was 27, 28 years old, 26 maybe. So she took care of her parents in those years. So we had an awful lot to do with my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side as well.
You grew up very close to people.
Within 2 miles. You know, so we were back and forth a lot. But all these grandparents, these 3, they died in the early 40s, and that's another thing I remember. I was 10 years old when the first one died, and then in 2 years, all 3 of them died, and I lost an uncle during that time, so that was kind of characteristic of those early years too, the funerals. My dad's brother died, and my mother's brother died, and then the 3 grandparents, and I'm sure there were many, many others.
What was that like for you as a child?
Well, it was all family stuff. And sure, we grieved when my grandmother that we lived died. I think it was 1943. I'm not exactly sure now, but I would have been 11 years old at that time, and she was sick in our home. I mean, we had to open a door that divided the house so that my mother could go in and take care of my dad's mother. And we all, the rest of us slept upstairs, and I remember she was sick, I'm guessing maybe 3 months before she died. She had cancer of the liver. But we saw all of that, and so we'd gone to, we were kind of around that all the time, and I'd have to say that my recollection about it now is that it wasn't anything really so tragic. It was something because you were surrounded by family, and it seemed like death was a natural, a kind of a natural thing that at that time at least I didn't have a lot of concerns about it, although I do remember I got sick the day my grandfather Dreffs died, my mother's father. He died of a heat stroke. It was, I believe, in August, he crawled up in the windmill to grease a windmill in the morning, the mechanism at the top. He came down and he came in the house and he asked my grandmother for a glass of water, and he said, it's so hot today, somebody's going to die today. Well, he had suffered a heat stroke in the afternoon and died by 7 o'clock at night. And the thing about it was 114 degrees that day. My dad and brother, I believe, were at they were threshing at a farm, and about 3 miles from the site of my grandfather's death. And so my mother and I went over to my grandfather's farm, her parents' farm, and then others came, of course, because he was sick, and they called the doctor out and all of that. It was kind of interesting that morning he'd make the assessment that somebody was going to die that day, and it turns out that he had a stroke of some kind. Died the same day. So those are, and like I said, my mother was there all day, as well as some of her sisters and a few other people. And when we got home that night, I remember I got sick, and she kind of, I remember them talking about it, saying it was because of the stress. I was 11 years old at the time, 11 or 12. But,
what was your grandmother's funeral, the first funeral you went to as a child?
let me see. No, I have an idea. I can't give you specifics, but I have an idea. I was at other funerals before that. It was very common in that rural area that when someone died, the whole community got together at the funeral. And there was an interesting custom at that time, and that is where funeral homes now are the site of a prayer service prior to a church service. I remember when my grandmother Hartmann died, they brought some folding chairs over from the church to the house because the I would call the preliminary devotion would be in the home and not in the funeral home the day of the funeral. Usually, if the funeral was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there'd be a family service in the home where the person died at noon. And I remember it was in the morning. They had already brought the body, my grandmother, out in the casket and put her in the living room where she died. And these folding chairs were there from the church, and my mother told me to go in. I was 11 years old. Told me to go in and dust these chairs because they had been brought in, on an open vehicle. And so I went in there and I looked around. All at once I discovered that I was in the room alone with my dead grandmother, and I got the heck out of there. I wasn't too sure I wanted to stay around there. A little unsettling, right? Well, there she is.
How do you think your grandparents influenced you since you were pretty young with them, but you have memories of them?
Well, my grandmother Hartmann, of course, because we lived in the same house with her. My brother and I were over there a lot. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Her youngest daughter, my aunt, died some years ago, and a teapot came up on the auction sale. It was a blue teapot with kind of orange and gold in it, and I told my wife at the time, I said, we're going to buy that thing because this is the thing. My grandmother always made tea for us, and when we'd go over there in the evening, and she always had a sack of peppermint candy in her cupboard, and so we kind of enjoyed that. But what was so much fun was sitting down and having tea with her. But it was almost, we laugh about it now, but this was because she was frugal, and you didn't put a lot of tea grounds, into the tea. It was just kind of like colored water with sugar in it, but it was just the sociability of it was fantastic. She was a gentle soul. She was really a great woman, and I remember when she had one of these glassine stoves that you dump briquettes in on the, I don't know if you know what briquettes are, but these are these pressed coal. You dump it into the top. No, I guess it was hard coal. That's right. It was not briquettes. It was hard coal. But she couldn't lift it up there, so early on, when my brother and I got tall enough, she would grab one side of this coal bucket, we would get on the other side, and then lift it up and dump the whole bucket in the top because it would then filter down as it burned. And so that was one of the chores that we had to do in the winter for her. And matter of fact, I remember a rocking chair that she had. She always sat in. And somehow, and I can't tell you exactly how, my wife and I got a hold of that thing, and I refinished it. And now we have it in our own home right next to our fireplace. So that's kind of a neat little memory from her. But my brother and I used to sit in that thing and rock like crazy until it would move on the runners, rocking runners, but we would skid forwards and backwards because we were rocking so hard. And then we'd been scolded mildly, but it was never anything super serious.
Was your grandmother a strict woman, would you say? Or?
Oh, no. Any kind of discipline was usually done by my parents. I mean, she was just a very neat lady. Although I remember one time she was coming in. They had built an entry on that side of the house, so she would have an outside entry rather than coming through where we lived. And I hid in there and scared the daylights out of her one time. And she had a walking stick. And I got that waved at me. And she said to me in German, "Don't ever do that again."
You said that your aunt lived with your grandmother for a while. Were you close to her?
Very close to her. She was my baptismal sponsor. She was the youngest in the family, and actually, she married. I'm not going to say later in life, but she had a cousin who was married to a gentleman from near Parkston, South Dakota, and this cousin of hers died, I believe, as a consequence of childbirth at age 28, and then this lady that died, her husband, Julius Fryer, married my dad's youngest sister, and but she was a baptismal sponsor, and so we always felt very close to her. And the gentleman that she married was an interesting guy. He had a tremendous sense of humor, and we really liked him. And my parents spent a lot of time with them, and it really enjoyed the company as well as the relationship. And of course, they had the common interest in Grandma Hartmann too, so they were there an awful lot.
So how many brothers and sisters did your parents have?
Oh I think my mother had, she was one of 11 children, and my dad one of 9, or was it the other way around? I forget now. But our children have 19, my age, I shouldn't say our children, we had 19 sets of uncles and aunts. 96 first cousins. They were a prolific bunch on both sides.
Oh. Were you close to all of your aunts and uncles, or?
Well, yes and no. I had aunts and uncles. Since my parents both came from the younger end of their families, they had older brothers and sisters, so my mother had some nieces and nephews who were almost as old as she was. Because my mother was born, I suppose she was born maybe 4 years before her oldest brothers and sisters had children. So they were very close. She was very close to her nieces and nephews. In fact, my early recollection is when she had people over, they were nieces or nephews. So so far as the uncles and aunts, yes, I knew them all except several that moved out of the community. I had an aunt, one of my father's sisters moved to North Dakota with her family, and then earlier, must have been about 1913, 1912, his oldest sister moved to Canada, and we just kind of lost track of that family. But the rest that were in the area, we saw them all from time to time.
Were you close, since your mom had her nieces and nephews, were you really close to your cousins? Did you have some that were closer in your age too, as well?
Oh yes, yeah. There was a group. I would say perhaps maybe a dozen or so that were in the area that we saw repeatedly. And of course, entertainment was Sunday afternoons to drive from our home to Tripp, to visit my mother's family, and a lot of these cousins of mine, a lot of those were already gone, but they were usually large families. As I said, I had 96 first cousins, and I was in a small family. My parents only had the two of us, my brother and myself, but the others had a lot of children, so their younger children usually were probably a little bit older than we were, but always, spent a lot of time visiting, and entertainment on Sundays usually was to visit some relative or friend or have them come over, and then we'd be tearing around the yard until chores time, about 5 o'clock, and everybody would go home. But that was the system.
If you had to say, who would be the aunt or uncle that influenced you?
Oh my. Well, I was very close to my Uncle John. They lived about a mile from our place, and their kids were very close to the age of my brother and myself. And I guess the reason I was close to him because he kind of liked me and liked us, and he gave every evidence of it. And hospitality was always there. They liked to kid around. I had another uncle, my mother's next oldest sister's husband, who was also a baptismal sponsor. They lived another mile the other direction. 2 miles the other direction. And he loved to kid around. He'd tease a lot. And I guess we kids, we kind of like that. And, you know, the other interesting thing about these close uncles is that we usually did, well, at the time before they combined corn, corn would be picked either by hand or with a machine, stored until it dried out in the winter, and then you'd have these corn shelling parties. A bunch of farmers would get together and shell corn. Well, we kids, we would, and by that time I mean between 1940 and 1950, even into the 50s. You know, I was 20 years old in 52, so I remember that one of the neat things about working together in a group is that we would work like crazy, you know, and we would get complimented by our uncles and aunts and the close neighbors because we were workers, you know, we were efficient, we could get things done. And then once you get a compliment like that, you just redouble your efforts. But that was kind of neat. I mean, talk about self-esteem and affirmation. It was all around. They were very disciplined people. They're the kind of people that, you know, if something went wrong, they let you know about it. But when something went right, they also let you know about it in spades. So that was neat.
Who would be your closest cousin in your childhood? Who would be closest to your cousin?
Well, I think probably spent more time at my Uncle John's. They had a daughter, my cousin Anna. She was my age, and there's a picture where when we were little, we were both sucking on a bottle of milk, sitting on a carpet out in the front yard, and they were just. And then she had a younger brother, an older brother, and a younger sister, and so on. But I think with her brother Werner and Anna, I think they were probably the closest. We had a good relationship. We didn't go to school with those. Their school was in another township. So the other two were two named Arnold and Richard Fink, and they were my mother's nephews, our cousins, and we went to school together in the same building, country school, and that was kind of neat because these guys were just a little bit older than my brother and myself, and they had more ideas, you know, for recess activities and things like that. So we spent a lot of time with them. One hilarious story about them was that in the fall of the year they trapped skunks. This was when they were maybe 12, 14, 15 years old. And on the way home, my brother and I discovered that in a culvert next to our neighbors there was a skunk. And we thought, well, if you get $2 for a skunk hide, you know, this is a pretty easy way. So we lit a fire on one end of the culvert, and my brother was stoking the fire on one end, and I stood on the other end with a stick. And the skunk never did leave. It got close enough to the opening of the other end of the culvert that it got fresh air, so it never did come out. But it must have been quite a picture. And so the game warden came out. He didn't come to our place. He came to these two cousins. And they had actually trapped skunks illegally. And so he was confronting them, and then he asked them, do you know of anybody else that was violating the game rules? And they said, yeah, the Hartmann boys. And then when they described how old we were, and I think I was probably 11 or 12. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But anyway, when the game warden found out how old we were, he didn't even bother to come over. Furthermore, we never got any skunks.
A failed attempt.
Yeah, exactly.
Thinking back to your dad, how would you describe his character?
Dad was a very hard-working person, gentle soul, very, very committed to his work, very frugal. He was well liked because he was, I think, an extraordinarily fair person. I remember one time there was a dispute he had with a neighbor. We were baling alfalfa or hay or something, and their figures didn't match in terms of, they paid each other by bales, you know, just to offset the costs of operating. And I remember this neighbor came over and they, I mean, there was never any anger. They just resolved the problem. And I always remember my dad sitting in the pickup working with Walter and getting this thing squared away. He was just an extraordinarily fair person. And I heard him apologize to the neighbor because he had suggested some wrong figures. And I really admired him. He was a gentle soul. But very fair, very hardworking. The sad thing about it was when he was dying of cancer, one time he wanted to go fishing. Never went fishing before, and I, you know, obviously was older at that time. It was 1973, and I thought to myself, how pathetic, you know, that he didn't really feel that he could take the time earlier to enjoy himself. And here he had this rod and reel that he was using in a little dam and sitting there, you know, waiting for the fish to bite bullheads, I suppose. So it was that part of it was really kind of sad. But I don't think he ever regretted it. He was just that kind of a person. Kind of stick to it and grind away and enjoy the little things in life. He had prostate cancer, and I think from the time he was diagnosed until he died, I'm seeing 3.5 years, 4 years, something like that. I'm not exactly sure. But I was I was a pastor in Hecla, South Dakota at the time, and then later on up at Arthur near Fargo, and so every chance we had, we'd go down and visit. He had a lot of pain. Really a lot of pain. Today, you know, they do it completely differently. But he tried to hold out as long as he could, and then he would take a pain pill, and now, of course, they say just keep it down. And different philosophy. But I'd have to say he suffered quite a bit, and was in a lot of pain.
How old was he?
70. He died at 70.
Thinking of his mother, how would you describe your mother?
Well, she was a typical farm wife, not afraid to get in there and really work, and she was an excellent cook. And I think her greatest fear in life was to run out of food when there was company or something. She's one of these people that, you know, one meat won't do it. You have to have 2 kinds of meat and 2 desserts and 2 salads and pie and, you know, the whole bit. As I said, she liked her nieces and nephews. She had a lot of nieces in the area that would come over and help when there was a butchering or something like that, or during the threshing run. She liked to have them come over and give her a hand as hired girls. And so she had an enjoyable time with them. But other than that, she played the piano. Mostly for her own entertainment. I don't think she would have had the, well, maybe she played for like the women's group at the church, but I rather doubt that. But for the most, I would say yes. I don't ever remember her saying that she took lessons, but I suspect whatever musicians that were in the area, her relatives or friends, I would suspect that they probably gave her a few pointers, but I would say she's largely self-taught.
Did she read music or just play?
No, she read music. She read music. I have to tell you the story of how we came by a piano. We were out in the field in, it wasn't April or May, probably late May, picking rocks in the cornfield. My mother and Dad were out there, and my brother and myself, and all at once this truck shows up. And it's from Mitchell, South Dakota. It was a piano company from Mitchell, South Dakota. Now, believe this or not, the guy had a piano in the truck. And we went out in the field, we stopped what we were doing, and he opened the back of the truck, and he played on this piano a little bit. And he sold the piano to my parents right there in the middle of the field. It's the craziest thing you can imagine. But I still remember the name of it. It's called a Go Branson piano. And, yeah, and then it was one of these that it was a smaller piano, It was not one of these great big heavy 5-ton deals. But anyway, it was in our home. In fact, my brother still has it in his own home. But that was sold in the middle of a cornfield by a guy who just brought it out. Well, in fact, that's the way a lot of the businessmen did it in those days. I remember in 1941, a car dealer from Parkston Armor brought a 1940 Chevy out there and brought it out and offered it to my dad to sell. My dad bought it. I mean, this is just the way they did it.
They're always out in the field. You have to.
Well, exactly, and it was just amazing that maybe Dad had told him before that he was interested in a car or something, and so he brought it out and showed it to him. Dad says, "Okay." It's not the way they do it today anymore, I'll tell you.
No, definitely. If you could describe, how would you describe your parents' relationship with each other?
Well, I've never, they were not openly affectionate to each other. I think they really appreciated each other. They cared about each other very much. They had some very earnest discussions from time to time, and probably I'd have to say I'd be naive if I said they didn't agree with each other from time to time. But it was never one of these deals where there was a problem. I do remember one time in the middle 40s, the estate, my grandmother had died, and the estate came up for sale, and my parents bought the home, the farm, the quarter section where we lived, and then sometime later had a chance to buy another piece of property. And I remember this was in the probably late 40s, where Dad, things were turning around and getting a little bit better, but my dad was always super cautious. And I do remember one time when Dad said, that loan just sticks in my throat up to here. And my mother turned to him and said something, kind of, well, we'll get through it, I mean, she was giving all kinds of encouragement. We'll get through this. We'll get this thing paid for. Well, it turns out they did, but I can't say that was a disagreement. It was just kind of an expression of hesitancy about whether they're really going to be able to make it. But they worked very hard. My mother had her so-called chicken chores for grocery money and would drag 5 gallons of bucket, 2 5-gallons of bucket across the yard until we finally got running water over there, and worked very, very hard. Canned and gardening and the whole bit, and of course my brother and I were right in the middle of it because we didn't have any sisters to pass this off on. And so the gardening and the butchering and the canning and all of that, and house cleaning and all of that, my brother and I were always in up to our ears with that kind of work, as well as outside so-called farm work. But my mother was very good at what I call fast foods. During the butchering season, she'd can a lot of sausage and meats, and they would be processed in a big boiler and then go down into the basement, or into the cellar, we called it. And so let's say, for example, we're out harvesting and we're shocking grain. We come home at 11:30 in the morning to get something to eat. She'd just go into the cellar and get a quart jar of this sausage or other meat and shake it out into a frying pan and throw in some potatoes, and in 5 or 10 minutes we had something to eat. And but that took a lot of preparation. All of life was then in getting all these things ready, and so that's kind of the way it was on the farm. But my mother did help a lot. I know we went for parts, machinery parts, a lot. Dad would be on the binder with the tractor and so on, and let's say a sprocket broke, and he could, maybe for some reason he could still keep going, or there was another problem and she would take off for town. I remember one time she was just totally embarrassed because it was so urgent, and my brother and I rode along to Delmont to get this part. And when she got out of the car, she realized she had her bedroom slippers on. She didn't have regular shoes. And my mother is a very modest person, and this was just really devastating to be caught out in town with your bedroom slippers. But anyway, she thought it was a bad deal, but nobody else thought anything about it.
How did your parents meet?
Well, they just lived in the neighborhood. My mother lived a mile and a half from where my dad grew up. And it's kind of interesting. They have pictures in those years for entertainment. Young people I would say anywhere from 15 to 25 would go to, on Sunday afternoons, they'd go over to the neighbors. Well, we have some pictures where Dad is over at the neighbors and my mother happened to be there, and you know, there's a group of young people sitting around, and I have an idea that they just knew each other from church, and it's not uncommon, you know, for two brothers to marry two sisters, or you know, right within the community, within driving distance. That was very common back there in the 20s and 30s. And so there have been a few photographic records of that kind of association, but not an awful lot, but enough to kind of know what their culture was like. There's a bunch of young people from a church who would gather for entertainment on Sunday afternoons. I mean, face it, they worked 6 days a week, and you know, so that's when they had their time off. And interestingly enough, they were always dressed up at those gatherings on Sunday afternoons. They didn't get into their so-called grubbies to do anything. When my brother and I were growing up, when we were 14, 15, 16 years old, we got together with the kids in the neighborhood, but we were already mobile then. We had horses. We would ride from one farm to the next and race, and did all sorts of crazy stuff with the horses, and which was, you know, was really kind of a lot of fun. Mostly just go from one farm to the other, and whatever you were able to pull off in terms of races. I remember one time this cousin Anna I was telling you about. They had a Shetland pony, and a very agile. It was a kind of a pony that if the pony didn't want you on its back, it would get you off. But she rode up on, you know what I mean by a straw pile? This is when they used to thresh, and they blew all the straw. They brought the grain on wagons from the fields to the farm, and then the grain would be threshed out of it, and the straw would be blown on a great big pile. Well, this Anna, she rode that pony up on top of the straw got hard after a while, and there's a picture of her with her pony up on top of the straw pile. And these straw piles were treacherous because they would slip and slide, or you could slide into crevices in them, and well, sometimes they were 16, 20 feet high.
How old was she when she did that?
I suppose 13, 14. But these are the so-called exciting things to do.
Yes.
My goodness.
Would you say you were close to your father?
Well, yes, I would say so. I think I annoyed him an awful lot by going into our tool shed. I was a tinkerer, and I played with his tools in the tool shed. This is the place where he would fix machinery and things, and probably annoyed him by leaving too many tools lying around in the dust and so on. But he never said not to do it. In fact, he always encouraged it. One of the things that I did with my dad after World War II. He bought a surplus machine shed. This is a corrugated steel shed that they built in the South Pacific during World War II. And after the war, so many of those were left over, so a lot of farmers would buy them for their own machine sheds. But he took a look at the plans, and he said, this was 1947, I suppose I was 16, 17 years old. He said, Marvin, you read up on these plans, and you figure out how to put this foundation together. So that was my first construction project. And I staked out the building and put up the forms, and we put bolts in to bolt it down, poured the cement, and then built this machine shed. And he never looked at a blueprint. And he just kind of said, you do it. And I was kind of proud to do it. Got it all done, got together, everything worked fine. It worked just fine. The only guy that made a mistake was a former serviceman who was working at the top, and actually you could nail the sheeting to the framework. You could actually use nails because the framework was such that you would find the space between the metal parts and just drive the nail in there. Well, he drove them in too hard and started to flatten these corrugations, and his part, the roof was moving faster than the rest, so I'm 17 years old, I had to tell him to cool it, to slow it down because we were getting distorted. Well, anyway, little side project. Well, I thought, I mean, I was amazed that he let me figure the thing out. But that was part of his skill too. He was very good at it.
We're going to go ahead and start a game. We just finished about how your dad influenced you, or how close you were to your dad. How close were you with your mother?
Worked a lot with my mother. I mean, as I said, I had no sisters, and consequently, there were some things that needed to be done at home, you know, in the house, and we got in on all of that. I know that so far as dusting and cleaning and scrubbing and even like wallpapering, I remember we used to do wallpapering. It's, every once in a while we would have to remove the wallpaper from the living room, and it wasn't painted in those days, and so my brother and I would get in there and wet everything down and scrape the old wallpaper off and start over again. And I remember one time, this was probably, I'm guessing, probably in 48, something like that. My mother, we went to pick out the wallpaper in Mitchell and got it home, and it was kind of striped wallpaper. And I said to her, why don't we, instead of putting it on vertically, you know, up and down, let's go around this way. And she at first thought, I mean, this is crazy, you know, to do it this, to go around this way. But we did. And it was kind of neat. It looked pretty nice. And the one thing it did draw a lot of comments from people who, you know, would visit and they'd see this wallpaper that went around this way. I mean, what's the deal here? But it worked, and a little innovative, and she was willing to go along with that.